right. Good afternoon. I'm going to open with prayer and then we'll get into it. Father, we come before you today and we thank you for the beautiful weather. We thank you for the sun. We thank you for the cooler weather that came through last night. It has been a blessing today. We thank you for the ability to come together to study your word, to get to know your character more, and to understand you better so that we may live out your word more in the midst of the people in our community and draw more people to your kingdom. We thank you, we love you, and we bless you. Amen. Amen. All right. So, a couple new people tonight. So I'll tell you, this is not a sermon. This is somewhat of a led Bible study. What we did was last year we did a 15-week course on the history of the Bible. Went straight from that into how to study the Bible. And we did Jonah, and now we're in the book of Micah. And so we're just going chapter by chapter in the book of Micah, and so I kind of help guide some things through the book, but also ask questions and ask for input. We do have people that watch online, so if you make a comment or a question, I usually repeat it back so people can hear through the recording what's being said or what's being asked. So if I repeat your question, it's not because I can't hear. It's I just want them to know what's being asked. So we're in Micah chapter 4. So if you have your Bibles, you can flip to there. We'll read it in just a second. I'll give an introduction here to Micah chapter 4. We usually go for an hour and 15. I said that, and then last week it was like an hour 20, hour 25. So I'm going to be even if we don't, there's kind of a lot in this chapter. Even if we don't get to it all, I'm going to do a hard stop and respect everybody's time at an hour 15. So this is chapter 4, obviously. Chapters 1, 2, and 3, we've kind of gone through the first cycle of oracles for Israel from the prophet Micah in chapters 1 and 2. And then in chapter 3, it was a new cycle of oracles coming from Micah with another judgment oracle again. So chapter 3 was the second judgment oracle. It's a large one. If we remember, that oracle was about the leaders. It had gone from the nation as a whole and kind of dwindled from there down to the leaders of the people, and they were abusing and oppressing the people underneath them for personal gain, for personal profit. And we noted the extra gruesome language from chapter 3, where God viewed the injustice and the terrible oppression that they were doing to their people as if they were eating the people alive, putting their bones and their flesh into cooking pots and eating it. So we go from that to chapter 4, one of the largest hope oracles here for the book of Micah. And so it actually runs chapter 4 and chapter 5. Tonight, we may not even get through chapter 4, but we'll definitely do a lot. But I wanted to kind of give some open remarks there so that you understand that this actually flows through this chapter and the next. And so it goes from a huge judgment oracle to a huge oracle of hope. And we've talked about how the prophets, they kind of hold this judgment and mercy tension. They continue it throughout, the judgment of God and the mercy of God. And that's kind of what happens here. The oracle of hope has 8 stanzas. And so 8 little sections. And tonight we'll get through at least a few stanzas, hopefully through the first 4. But the first 7 stanzas are seen as a chiasm. So I know I've discussed it before. We'll discuss it again here. But a chiasm or a chiastic structure is a literary structure where I should have made a slide. I keep saying I'll do that for things like this. But it's where you usually have an odd number of verses or sections in a literary structure. And the first and the last are related and the same. The second, and say in this instance there's 7. So the first and the 7th are the same. The second and the 6th are the same. The 3rd and the 5th are the same. And then the middle section, which is the 4th for this section, is really the focus. It's the highlight of what that literary structure is really wanting the hearer or the reader to understand. So that's how it's built here. And there's an 8th stanza that comes at the end. It doesn't fit the chiastic structure, but it emphasizes the main point again at the end of this oracle. So I'll give you, so you can kind of understand, I kind of wrote some things here. I kind of broke it down by that by that structure so you can kind of understand. So the first part's going to talk about the nations in Israel, or Israel in the nations. So it's going to be, here's what you're going to look like in the nations. Well, the seventh one is talking about Israel and the nations again. And then the second one is talking about the coming kingdom. And then again in chapter 5, we're going to see the coming kingdom. Then you're going to have the absent king in the third one. And the fifth one is going to be the struck king, but it's the focus on the king again. And then right in the middle, this is the main thing. If this is a little too technical for some of y'all, the main point is that the focus of this oracle is that God, Yahweh, the God of Israel, has a plan. And even though the people of Israel feel like they're being destroyed, they're being put in a lot of pain, they're being, taken away from everything they know, it's kind of like God he pulls back the curtain and says, look, I'm in charge. I have a plan. This is what's going to happen. Maintain your faithfulness in me, and we'll see it through. So that's the main focus of these two chapters in this, what we call this hope oracle, this section of Micah. So let's read. I'm going to read the chapter, and then we'll just go verse by verse like we always do. So Micah chapter 4, verse 1. It's going to be 13 verses, but again, they're kind of lengthy. So verse 1, it says, "And it will be in the future, the mountain of the house of Yahweh will be established as the preeminent mountain. And it will be lifted above the hills, and people will stream to it. And many nations will come, and they will say, come and let us go up to the mountain of Yahweh, and to the house of the God of Jacob, so that he will teach us his ways, and we may follow after him. For from Zion the law will go out, the word of Yahweh from Jerusalem. And he will judge between many people, and he will convict the distant mighty nations. And they will beat their swords and plowshares, and their spears to pruning knives. Nations will not lift up a sword against nations, and they will no longer prepare for war. And each will sit under the vine tree and under the fig tree, and there is no cause for fear. For the mouth of Yahweh of war has spoken. Though all the people they walk, each in the name of his God, we walk in the name of Yahweh our God, always and perpetually. In that day, utters Yahweh, I will gather the lame, and those banished I will assemble. That is, those whom I have disciplined. And I will make the lame as a remnant, and the removed as a mighty nation. And Yahweh will rule over them on Mount Zion from now and perpetually. And you, shepherd's tower, stronghold of the daughter of Zion, to you it will arrive. That is, the former dominion will come, the kingdom belonging to the daughter of Jerusalem. Now, why do you shout a shout? Is there no king among you? Or has your advisor perished, that agony like childbirth has taken hold of you? Writhe and bring forth, daughter of Zion, like one giving birth. For now you will leave the city and dwell in a field, and go to Babylon. There you will be delivered. There Yahweh will redeem you from the power of your enemies. And now many nations have gathered against you, those who say, she will be defiled, then our eyes will gloat over Zion. But they do not know the plans of Yahweh, and they do not understand the wisdom. For he has gathered them as sheaves on the threshing floor. Arise and thresh, daughter of Zion, for your horn I will make iron, and your hoof I will make bronze, and you will pulverize many people. And you will devote to Yahweh their unjust gains, and their wealth to the Lord of all the earth. Amen. Amen. So verses 1 through 7. This is the first stanza. And like I said, we always go verse by verse, but just an introduction to this stanza. Verse 1 through 7 speaks of the hope of future peace and restoration, but it's talking about Israel amongst the nations. Future hope for Israel includes drawing the nations to Yahweh. So here the hope starts with giving them a purpose in their pain, and that'll be kind of a theme throughout, but they're about to be pushed out amongst the nations, but God says the nations will actually run to him. Their faith in Yahweh, Israel, it's their faith that's going to separate them from the other nations, but it's also what will be the draw towards God for the nations. for those who remain faithful amongst this punishment they're going to endure, God will use it as a means to bring other people, the nations, the Goyim, to him. Most of what is mentioned in this oracle is yet to come. When we started talking about prophecy, less than 2% of all prophecy in the Bible is forward-looking from our time forward. Most of it's looking at their immediate generation or shortly thereafter and the works that God would do then. Some were looking to the time of Jesus' first coming, but very few are really looking beyond that. But here, Micah chapter 4 is good for us because this is a chapter that deals with something we all have to look forward to. And what do I mean by that? This chapter talks about, complete peace and rest for all nations, something the world's never seen yet. And so, peace is still a hope for the world, and, that's the focus here. The covenant of Abraham in Genesis 12:3, we've talked about how Micah focuses on this covenant with Abraham, and he focuses on Deuteronomy and the curses and the blessings there. And so that's going to be continued in chapter 4, where he's focusing on these two things, reminding them of what Abraham's promise was to bless the nations and what the curses of Deuteronomy would say if they didn't fulfill their duty. So let's get into verse 1. It will be in the future, the mountain of the house of Yahweh will be established as a preeminent mountain, and it will be lifted above the hills, and people will stream to it. So any thoughts just immediately on verse 1, the very first verse of this Hope Oracle?
That means New Jerusalem?
New Jerusalem? That's, I think that's kind of what, this whole chapter is about, really. New Jerusalem, the future kingdom to come. I think that's really what it is. Mine says in the future. Anyone else have something in verse 1 that's different? In the last days, yeah. End of days, yep. And so this phrase, in the last days or in the end of days, we always think of that as like eschatological, right? Like looking at the end of time. It's not always the case. Sometimes it just means like in the future or in the near future, something like that. It's used several times in the Bible to talk about just something that's going to happen even soon at times, but the context tells you that it's eschatological or end of days. So I think end of days is appropriate here. Deuteronomy 4:30 is one that just means, it uses the same phrase. It says, when you're in distress and all these things have happened to you, in the future, or in Deuteronomy it says, in the last days, you will return to the Lord your God and obey him. Well, this is something that actually happens individually to us, like when we get pressed and we know that we're not living according to God, we return to him. It happens to the nation of Israel multiple times. So it's not always that. But it is sometimes that. What else? Anything else in verse 1?
As chief of the mountains instead of preeminent.
Oh, as chief of the mountains. Oh, I like that. That's good. So do you think there's a difference there? Or do you like one or the other?
Well, it's the main chief.
The main mountain. I have a quote here I want to read before we move to the mountain because I think that's a good point. Oswald, he's a scholar that's probably one of the best scholars for Isaiah. And I remember when I was studying Isaiah, I was using some of his resources. And he talked about this concept of looking to the future that I thought would be important for us. He says, the Hebrews didn't face the future like we do. So we always look forward. We're like, what's tomorrow bring? What's the next year bring? What's the end of my life bring? What can I do in the next 5 years? That's kind of a Western mindset, a Western comment is, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Ancient Israel didn't really view time that way. So he says they didn't view it the way. Rather, they faced the past and they put their backs to the future. So the past was always before them and the future behind them. This is thus, this phrase is not a technical one in the Old Testament referring to the millennial age or even a period beyond that. It's really, speaking of just kind of in the future, something that they can't see, but God gives them moments where they can see. We think we can see the future all the time, right? I think well, I'm putting things in place. I'm going to be a doctor, and I'll have a house with a white picket fence and 3 kids or whatever. They didn't think that way. So just a side note. But chief of the mountains, I think that's I like chief of the mountains. What does that mean, to be chief of the mountains? What does it mean for his mountain to be chief of the mountains?
Be the highest mountain.
Be the highest mountain?
Smaller mountains, I mean, that's the biggest mountain.
Who all's been to Israel? I know me and Tommy. Anybody else been to Israel? Tommy, I'll just ask Tommy since he's been. Mount Moriah, the mountain of the Lord. Is it the chief of the mountains? No, it's the smallest of all the mountains surrounding it. God in his humility, I forgot the verse, he actually says, I'm going to make my name rest on this mountain. It's not going to be the chief one. It's not going to be the greatest one. It's a humble mountain. And he says that about the nation of Israel, too, in Deuteronomy 7. I didn't choose you because you were great in number. I choose you because you were small. So here, this picture would be tangible to them. His mountain is really almost the lowest hill in the region. The mountains surrounding it are all higher. You go to the Mount of Olives. That's where everybody the famous picture that everybody kind of sees where you take pictures of the Temple Mount behind them with the gold dome. If you remember, think about that perspective. It's always looking down. Mount of Olives is much higher. So what does it mean? We talked about mountains in chapter 1 and high places. So thinking about that, understanding that they saw a real literal thing, I don't think that they would have understood that Mount Moriah would grow. So what could he be saying here by saying the mountain? And he doesn't use temple here. That's important. It's the mountain of the house of Yahweh. It was the place where his temple dwelled, but here it doesn't use temple at all. It just used the word house. So what are your thoughts there? High places and mountains. What did that mean in chapter 1? Anybody remember when we talked about that?
That was places of worship.
Places of worship, yeah. So what does it mean for his mountain to be the chief of mountains? What does that mean? Be worshipped by a few people or worshipped by all, right? All the nations, yeah. So this is more pointing to his prominence as and being recognized amongst all the nations, not just Israel, but everyone sees him as the one and only God to be worshipped in the future. It's lifted up, this chief of the mountains is lifted up. There's 2 reasons that I have. One is the role that it plays in the people coming, right? The people come to worship. This is where they want to have a relationship with God. But also, if we remember chapter 1 and this thing of high places, it's also where people worshipped other gods, the high places. And so this is also saying that there's no longer going to be a competition. A lot of the prophets speak against Israel because they were serving Yahweh, but then they'd go down the hill and go to someone else's hill and serve that other deity as well. So there's no more going to be a competition. There's only one great and high mountain. I have a note here to tell you, there's a huge conversation to be had about the high mountains. When we think about the Temple Mount being a lower mountain than that surrounding it. In the ancient world, they viewed the worship sites, that the higher they were, the better relationship you could have with that God. So, for God, the creator of the universe, to put his temple on a lower mountain was shown to be humility, but also this here symbolizes God's reign over all. It's not that Mount Moriah, again, it's not that it's going to grow, but that he'll be recognized without it having to grow, if that makes sense. It also looks back to creation. Anybody, where did the Garden of Eden rest? Where was it? Anybody know?
What the Garden of Eden was?
Where did it rest? Where was it? Up on a mountain. Yeah, a lot of people don't realize the Garden of Eden was on a mountain. And it's where all the 4 rivers flow downstream from this one location. I think it's Ezekiel that actually clarifies and said it was on a mountain. And so this picture you get from creation, you have this earth with these chaotic waters, and then God separates the water from land. And we can see the globe now with all of our technology. We can see mountains everywhere. But when reading the creation story, you get this idea that the waters separated and this one mountain came up. And so that same concept here with this rising mountaintop, that it's God's dominion over creation that will be recognized. Excuse me, he's always had dominion, right? But it's the recognition of that. So who's going to stream to the mountain? What are your... Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to say shortly that also the mountain chief mountain and all that. I think a picture of it is also about the authority and the sovereignty of God as opposed to the height of the mountain. And if you look at what the devil said, that I will put my what I will arise above the mount of God.
Mm.
He really was not referring to a physical mountain. He was talking about you will go beyond the authority and the sovereignty of God.
That's it. That's a good point. So Ron is saying that that it's less about a mountain, and I completely agree that mountain here is a metaphor for the authority and the sovereignty of God as King, that His throne rests higher than any other authority in the world. And so it's I love that. I appreciate that, Ron. So the mountain here, as it is elsewhere. I was thinking of the psalm as you were speaking. There's a psalm, and I can't remember the psalm, what number. There's a psalm that says, "Look up to the high mountain where your God resides." Our God doesn't reside on a mountain, but it's saying look to His sovereignty, look to His authority, rest in His comfort and the peace that He gives you. That's really good. And so these people are going to stream to it. Mine says people. Anybody else say anything else other than people? What's yours say?
Oh, no, but I just thought it was odd the way it says peoples will flow up to it. But when
Ah.
you think of flow,
Yeah.
that's always- I mean, if something's gonna flow, generally you're thinking of it going down, but it's gonna flow up.
Yeah, so you kind of jumped ahead here. I had separated those two, but they go together. So the people, the focus is that the people are not Israel. You know, Micah and most prophets are speaking to Israel. But here Micah says the nations, Goyim, the Gentiles, they're going to stream to the mountain of Yahweh and stream up it. So I love this language because if you remember, someone flip back to chapter 1, verse 4. And anybody who wants to read it can read chapter 1, verse 4.
The mountains will melt away under him, and the valleys will split apart like wax before the fire, like water being poured down a slope.
Like water being poured down the slope. So God in chapter 1, when He starts this whole judgment against Israel, they say, look, Yahweh's coming down out of the mountain. And He's going to crush the high places. He's going to crush these mountaintops. And all the mountaintops are going to flow down the mountainside like water streaming down a slope. And so now we have this picture, this reversal. It's really beautiful. This reversal of God's judgment that causes all of these high places to stream down like water. And now these people will stream up like water to a mountain that's higher than ever had been before. So you get this beautiful poetic and metaphorical language of a reversal of this judgment that comes in chapter 1, where Yahweh says all of these high places will flow like water, and water flows downhill, but here the people will flow up this great and mighty mountain that's greater than anything they've seen. So that's really good. This nahar, this verb about flowing and streaming, it's only found 2 other times in the scripture. Isaiah 2:2 is one. I'll read it. Tell me if you think it sounds familiar. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's house will be established at the top of the mountains and will be raised above the hills. All nations will stream to it. That sound familiar?
I was gonna ask you, I had a footnote on that, I was gonna ask you who plagiarized
Who plagiarized who, Isaiah or Micah? That's a good question. My personal opinion, I believe that Micah was one of the earlier prophets. So I see Jonah, the book of Jonah, whoever wrote it, being the earliest of the classical prophets. And then afterwards, Micah or Amos, one of the two, are who come next. And Isaiah comes later. And so it may not be that they plagiarized. We have to remember that God's in control of His word. And so
same message to both guys.
spoke the same message to both prophets, that's right. But it is very, very similar. So it could be that Isaiah heard the words of Micah, and God used them again through him. Or it could be that this actually became a somewhat of a idiomatic phrase of God's coming hope in the future, like that people would have understood and kind of knew it, like we know phrases of speech today. The only other place it's used is Jeremiah 51. Now, this prophet uses it in kind of an opposite way. He says, I'll punish Baal in Babylon. I will make him vomit what he swallowed. The nations will no longer stream to him. So in Jeremiah, it's a curse against Babylon because nations have been streaming to false worship. But in Micah and Isaiah, the nations, through God's use of punishment through his people, they're going to go out, and then all the nations are going to learn about God. They're going to come and stream to him. Anything else on verse 1? That's a really good verse. I don't think we're getting through the whole chapter at all. That's a really good verse. Anything else? We'll move to verse 2 if not. So many nations will come. This is really continuing what was said in verse 1. So many nations will come and they'll say, come and let us go up to the mountain of Yahweh, into the house of the God of Jacob. So just looking at that first part of verse 2, what are some thoughts? Let me ask this question. So the nations will come and they're going to say these things. So what does that say about the nations, these people who were formerly not in covenant with God, and they make this statement? What does that say about them? What are some things you see in this statement? Come. That's good. Yeah, a lot of people converted. So they recognize that he's God and the creator of the universe and that he's worthy of worship. And what stuck out to me is that, in the ancient world where gods were around every corner, they didn't recognize that this was just some other god who was more powerful than others. They recognized that he is Yahweh, the God of the house of Jacob. And so to recognize him as that means they believe there is no other God. That they had, lots of converts, like you said. Another part, just right there at the beginning, come and let us go. This isn't Israel like saying, hey, come check out our pad over here. Come check out our house. Come see what we've got. This is actually the nations encouraging each other. Let's go up to the mountain. I think that's really important to understand. What else? That's the future. Well, it's the future to them. I would say that this is probably the most messianic chapter of Micah. So I think like what Jesus said the kingdom is here and now, but yet to come. So sometimes he would say the kingdom is here, and then sometimes he would say the kingdom is coming. And so I think that that's kind of how I view Micah 4 and these things. We'll get to the really crux of the matter. These verses that I see are really what we've seen and experienced in our time, that through Jesus, all people will come to know God. All people will come to the mountain of God, understand and recognize the authority of God through him. And so I think this is continuing. This is going on. People who were not originally Israel have come to know God intimately and are sharing that with each other. They're saying, come see who my God is. And so let's get into the bulk of the meat of the matter right here in the first two verses. But so I see it as a future because Micah's going to take it to a place where there is no one out there doing crazy stuff, right? He's going to say all war is going to stop and everyone will be at peace and everyone will come to the mountain. And those who don't will be punished forever. That's still in the future, right? Because we still have war. We still have people trying to keep people away from God. But it's kind of like Jesus said, the kingdom is here and yet to come. It's kind of that aspect. What else? What about the phrase, he will teach us from his ways and we may follow after him? What does that mean, to teach them his ways and follow after him? Let me ask it in a different way. What's the difference between he will tell us what to do and we'll obey it, and he will teach us his ways and we will follow him. Is there a difference there?
Well, when you know the truth, then you desire to walk in the truth rather than this is the law and you've got to follow it.
When you know the truth and want to walk in it. I think following, Jesus said, pick up your cross and follow me. That's not just about obedience to the things that he said to do and not do, but to live a lifestyle that emulates him. And this is somewhat of a criticism of Israel at the time, right? Because Micah's saying these things because they're actually not doing these things. They're not following Yahweh. And so it is a hope of things to come, but it's also a criticism to a nation. These Gentiles are going to come and follow Yahweh. Y'all can't even do it, and y'all have known him your whole life. You see what I'm saying? And so to follow him is less, because Jeremiah says they were going to his mountain and giving him sacrifices and offerings, but then they turned away and did what was grievous to him immediately afterwards. And so to follow him is more than just like, let's have some checks of do's and don'ts. I would say it's also not an intellectual pursuit, right? It's not like let me know what all I can know about God. His word is supposed to compel us to live like God, not just to say I know everything about God. Does that make sense? I see Jesus in this whole chapter. This whole chapter is full of Jesus. I don't know that we'll get there. Later on, there's towards the end, you have the reference, I think we talked about it before, to the shepherd's tower or the flock of the tower. I mean, in this chapter, we have a reference to Bethlehem itself and to Jerusalem and Bethlehem connected together. So you have definitely, Jesus is all in this. That's what, I definitely see that completely. What about the phrase, the law will go out? So it says, for from Zion the law will go out, the word of Yahweh from Jerusalem. This is what he says in this verse. This is why the nations run to him. But when I read that verse, my immediate thought is like law in our present context, like, well, the nations of America, the laws of our nation, we went and let Japan know what our laws were like, and everybody was like, oh, let's move to America. Do we think that's what that means? No, what does that mean? What's law mean in the biblical sense? Instruction, yeah, it means instruction. I think about Jesus. Jesus said the law of Moses. What is the law of Moses? I think that's really what they're referencing, the Torah. And so what's included there in the law of Moses? First 5 books? What's included? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And so I don't think, me reading through this, I'm not so sure that Leviticus is what really compelled the nations to come run to God's mountain. I would say, what we overlook when we say the law of Moses is we forget that the fact that the first 70 chapters has no law at all. It's all stories of creation, going back to Ron's comment about giving honor to the sovereignty of the creator of the universe. The first 70 chapters are the creation story, Abraham's promise, Joseph, the Exodus story. It's all stories of God's deliverance, love, and compassion and mercy to God's people. And that's kind of what I think when I see. A lot of times we kind of get bogged down in this concept of law being do's and don'ts that God tells us to do. But actually, the biblical writers and the biblical people in it viewed it as way more than that. That when we think about the law of Moses, we think about I always think about Exodus, 10 Commandments, Leviticus maybe, and the priesthood and the tabernacle. But what would they have thought? What was the first thing they thought? Why does God's instructions start with 70 chapters of a story? Tell you who he is. I think what's also important is that people could walk with God before he ever stood on a mountain and told them the 10 Commandments, right? He gives us 70 chapters to say Noah and Abraham and Jacob and Joseph, they all walked with God, lived for him, obeyed him, before he ever got up there and put anything on a couple of stone tablets. Me, personally, I think it's the the relationship that's contained in those first stories is what compels the people to run to God's mountain. Go ahead. Before Moses, I am. Before Abraham, I am. Yeah. Before Abraham, I am. The covenantal love that Jesus came and expressed was a love that was from the beginning. So for me, and there's a whole bunch bound up in that about how the nations would understand our creation stories, our first 70 chapters versus what they knew. But suffice it to say, our Bibles contain stories that outweigh their stories of violence and disregard for humans with a love of a God who has our best interest at heart. All right, I said a lot there. Anything else in verse 2? Nothing? All right, we'll go on to verse 3. So now he's going to go from this picture of nations running to him, and now this balance we talked about earlier, it's found again. So he's going to judge between many people, and he will convict the distant, mighty nations. All right, so what do we think here? I mean, outside of just the balance of mercy and judgment that we see between verse 2 and 3, what do we think about the swords being made to plowshares and pruning knives made from spears? Peace. And you can make them back into, the metal that they're using is soft metals. So you can make them from swords to plowshares, but you could obviously make them right back to swords. But what does this say about, where they're at? I think peace is where it's at. Look at the last line there. It says they will no longer train for war. This is something that's permanent. This is something that's not like a temporary ceasefire or anything like that. This is permanent. Isaiah 2:4, again, I'm not going to read it. Isaiah 2:4 has the same exact language. So 2:2 we read was the same exact from verse 1. 2:4 is the same exact from verse 3 here. We're not going to study war no more. Come sing it for us. I don't know that song. I'll look it up, though. Not going to study war no more. Yeah, we're not going to study war no more. Y'all know that song? It's a hymn. Is it a hymn? It's a hymn? Yeah. I haven't heard that one.
Mine says, nor will they learn war.
Yeah, nor will they learn war. I have my translation that I did is train for war, but same thing. Yeah, learn war. Learn war. No longer will they learn war. What do you think about the fact that what comes to mind if I highlight the fact that war weapons are turned into garden utensils? Destroying to creating, yeah. What was the first thing man was given as a vocation? To tend and guard the Garden of Eden. So here in this beautiful poetry of Micah's future hope of restoration, the people, the nations that are constantly at war with each other, wanting to have power and dominion, oppress others, God's going to bring it to a place where everyone returns to what was intended in the garden, to be content with working the ground and guarding and protecting God's provision. And I think it's a beautiful, that's beautiful. Down by the riverside. Down by the riverside, that's the name of the hymn she was talking about. All right, verse 4, we're getting somewhere. And each will sit under his vine tree and under his fig tree, and there will be no cause for fear, for the mouth of Yahweh has spoken. So I know I've spoken on this before. I think I spoke about it here in our Tuesday nights. So I don't want to go at length again if I have. But what does it mean to sit under a vine tree and under a fig tree? I'll tell you what I learned today that I didn't know before, and this is one of my favorite metaphors in the Bible, is that in the ancient Near East, Israel and the nations around it, they often grew their grapevines in conjunction with their fig trees. So this seems to be talking about two different things, but actually what they had in mind was probably the same thing, that they would see a fig tree where a grapevine would be working through it. And I think of here in the South, we have muscadines, and all my muscadines are up a tree. They all crawl up a tree. And so what do you think about this? If we've talked about this before, you can let me know, but tell me what you remember anyway. What does it mean to sit under a fig tree and a grapevine? Shelter. So both of them are known for their shade. I think here in the West, we have big, great oak trees. So we think, well, a grapevine and a fig tree is no shade at all. But over there, that's a lot of shade. You know what I mean? That's a lot of shade for that. What else? What's that? Picture of rest, complete rest, yeah. So I highlighted before, and maybe it was just in conversation, that to plant figs, how fast or how long does it take to produce figs and grapes?
Before the vine actually starts producing?
Yeah.
Usually
Several years. So like if I'm in a situation where I've got the threat of war, or I have danger, or we've been in a drought, am I going to plant fig trees or grapevines? I'm going to plant wheat, something that grows fast, oats and barley. But here, this picture of something that takes years to cultivate. So if I've got my fig trees and my grapevines, they've taken years to cultivate, and now I can enjoy them. Am I going to sit underneath them and pluck some grapes and eat them if there's danger and war on my front doorstep? No. So to sit under them means not only do they have peace, they have long-lasting peace. They've had the peace to be able to cultivate grapevines and fig trees, and they can sit underneath them and they can partake of the fruit. It's this really beautiful metaphor that's used multiple times. I have a reference here, 1 Kings 4:25. Throughout Solomon's reign, and this is important for this chapter, throughout Solomon's reign, Judah and Israel lived in safety from Dan to Beersheba, each person under his own vine and his own fig tree. So you kind of see that metaphor explained very directly there in 1 Kings 4, that to have complete peace and safety meant that you could relax underneath your fig tree. I found a book I hadn't found before from a scholar named, his last name's Jensen, and he specializes in, this book was focused on metaphors in the Old Testament of future hope. And so this is what he says about this vine and fig tree. First of all, it's a proverbial symbol for wealth and leisure, especially as characterizing Solomon's reign. They convey in concrete terms the larger blessings of one's having one's own family estate, having rest to eat, not being dependent on others, and being able to offer hospitality. That it's not even just about your own consumption, but if you have grapevines and fig trees, you're actually able to offer food to others. And so that's the future that they have, is this perpetual and complete rest. No fear. Any other comments? So I said it was important to understand that reference to Solomon's reign, right? Because what did it say? It said under Solomon's reign, all of Israel and Judah had complete peace, and they all sat underneath their fig tree and the grapevine. What does this say about Micah's generation? They're not. They're not, right? It's this hope is given to them, but the hope is it's like this ironic criticism. Here's what you should look forward to, but really what they are to look forward to is what they had in the past, but they messed it up. So this is, I forgot how many generations from Solomon. It's about 400 years from Solomon. And so they had, under Solomon, according to 1 Kings, under David and Solomon, they had what God says is their hope for the future. So it's really a criticism against them and their kings. It's saying, you had this, you should have been able to maintain it, but because you served yourselves, now it's a hope to look forward in the future. That seems kind of cruel, but it's really, almost kind of this beautiful way that God says, hey, you're going into exile. This generation's not in exile yet for Micah. You're going into exile. You're going to lose your whole nation, but don't worry. What you had with Solomon's reign, you're going to have that more. You're going to have that sevenfold. I think I had a couple questions that I would think of like Micah and what he's thinking to say. Do you want swords and spears or figs and grapes? If you had to choose between the two. I think a lot of people today and in Micah's time, they'd choose the sword and spears because we all want to climb whether it's real swords and spears or it's metaphorical swords and spears because we're climbing the corporate ladder. We're stepping all over people to make sure we get more. When we think about, swords and spears, what they're turning into plowshares, do you want this great amass of wealth and tangible, physical, wealth, or do you want, humble blessings? I think the humility of God is something that's so powerful. And so the God who doesn't want a temple, he wants a tent. The God who doesn't want this big, great mountain, he takes a small hill. Also ask his people to be the people who are willing to want the grapes and the figs over swords and Am I losing anybody there? That's kind of what I thought of there. Anything else in verse 4? How about verse 5? Though all the people, they walk, each in the name of his God, we walk in the name of Yahweh, our God, always and perpetually. So what's the irony of this verse?
That they weren't really walking in it.
They weren't doing that, all right? This is what they should have been doing since the time they were brought out of Egypt. But they're not doing it. It's really just kind of funny when we sit back and really think. Micah says this to a people, hey, this is what you got to look forward to. One day you're going to say, we'll walk with Yahweh forever. Man, that's a huge judgment, but it's a hope. It's a weird thing to say that. What else? What does that say for us? What does this verse say for us? I think this is one of the most modern, applicable verses in this chapter. Little G. Gods in our lives. Yeah, so we don't give honor to the gods around us. I think, about my kids. My kids are getting older. Will they be the ones who will honor God regardless of what the people around them are doing? I think that's what I see is like. Go ahead.
Bottom line is there's two choices. There's two choices who you want to serve. Whether God, small g, or the God of Israel, the Lord Yahweh.
That's it. Two choice. Well, one choice. Yeah, two. You got two things to choose from, and you got one choice. Are you going to serve Yahweh or serve the other gods? Are you gonna be the seed of the woman or the seed of the serpent? I think of Deuteronomy. God said, "I set before you life and death." You're going to choose life, which is worshiping Yahweh, or choose death, which is to walk away from Him and serve the other gods. That's good. It's an instruction or a choice, simple choice. What do you think about the phrase, we will walk in the name of Yahweh? So nowhere else in the Old Testament is this used. Usually when it says we will walk with God, it's usually like we will walk in His ways or we will walk with God. This says we will walk in the name of Yahweh, our God. Well, any kind of thoughts on differences there? No doubt that it's Him? Okay. Yeah. What else? Anybody else? What if I said, it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier. To walk in His ways is to kind of follow Him a little bit. You're hearing His instructions. But to walk in the name of Yahweh, to me, there's more power there. It's not just hearing what He says and saying we will do that. I put here that it was. It's not just following His ways or His instructions. It's following Yahweh's power, His reputation, and His actions. That the power of God goes with them. It's no longer saying, because the people of Micah's time, they said, oh yeah, we follow and worship Yahweh. But they didn't. They said it with their mouth, but they didn't do it with their actions. So here in this future, we will walk in the name of Yahweh. There's just so much more power to that for me. It's like we talked about bearing God's image, with what's her name, Carmen. With Carmen Imes, bearing his image. That's what this is. They're going to bear his image. It's no longer going to be lip service. It's going to be, they're going to emulate God. They're going to, when people see them, they will see God, which was his intent from the beginning, What else? Anything else?
That's a big responsibility.
That's a big responsibility.
Yeah. And when we say that we are following him and then we act differently, I think we also bear more,
Shame on his name.
what?
Yeah. Take the name in vain. Yeah. So it's a big responsibility to
Because you hurt a lot of other people when you don't live up to what you say. Yeah.
A couple weeks ago I gave a sermon on injustice. That injustice was one thing that, at least in the Old Testament especially, that God was really more concerned with than just about anything else. Are we acting with injustice? Because that shames his name. But as you were talking, I'm thinking of Jesus. What did Jesus, when his greatest attack, I don't like the word attack, his greatest opposition against the leadership of his time was what? Injustice, but hypocrisy. That they were doing, like you're saying, that they were saying one thing. They were whitewashed tombs, sepulchres. They were saying one thing, but not doing it. They were quoting the scriptures, but living against it, and that's a great shame to God. And I've seen that too many times. I mean, non-believers, their view of us, we get painted by those who poorly represent God. Non-believers say, well, Christians, they're just hypocrites. And that's what they see a lot of times, So we actually defraud or diminish the name of God when we act that way. Let's look at verse 6. So in that day, utters Yahweh, I will gather the lame and... Oh, yeah, back up. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
The end of verse 1 it says, and the people shall flow to it. And the end of verse 5, it says, and all of the peoples walk in each in the name of their God. And how do you just marry those two? One says peoples, is that just a few people?
Oh, okay.
And all the peoples, is that a lot of people?
Yeah, so...
Going to that high mountain and many more or not?
Yeah, so there's a doublet here that's happening that's against each other. And so earlier in the chapter, we have all the peoples that are rushing to the mountain. And here we have peoples who are not rushing to the mountain because they're serving their God. Later on in the chapter, God says he will destroy those who come against him in those times. That those who want to still do war, those who want to still come against each other, that he'll go against them in war and battle. And so there's still like this, where this chapter is talking about a remnant. There's a remnant of his people that will grow and bring in all the nations. There's also a remnant of the nations that seeks to grow and bring people against God. And so the verse here is saying, though all the people, and again, this play on words with people, goyim, the nations, though all the nations, they walk each in the name of his God, we walk in the name of Yahweh our Elohim. And that's the separation. This really goes with the verse before it. Not the verse before it. It goes up there where it's talking about all the nations coming. That's what their separation is going to be, because Micah is telling them about their coming judgment. They're going to be sent out to the nations. They're going to Babylon. And that's going to be what separates them, is that even though when they go to the nations and they're serving all these other gods, we, the people of Israel, we serve Yahweh always and perpetually. And that's, again, a judgment against their current status, but it's looking to the greater faithfulness that God is going to instill in them in the future, if that makes sense. I don't know if does that answer your question? Not really. Let's talk about it. Yeah, let's talk about it. I mean, what's...
Well, I think it kind of goes with the New Testament. Many are chosen. Many are called, few are chosen. And I kind of, in my mind, match it up to this. It said, like I said, in verse 1, it says peoples. It doesn't say all the peoples. It just says peoples. So
Oh, yeah.
Just a small.
That's right.
Not possibly there. But if you don't read any further and you read just one, you think, or I did anyway.
You think the entire
The
world.
whole world's gonna be converted. But then you get down to 5 and it says all the peoples. So you got a little amount of peoples and then a big amount of peoples. That's the way I see it. Maybe that's not it, but
No, I think you're on something there. So like verse 1, it says, and people will stream to it, the mountain. And then verse 2, it says, many nations will come, but that doesn't say all the nations will come. I think that's part of it. But I think in verse 5, the allness statement there in verse 5, about their future, though all the people they walk each in the name of his God. Well, it's speaking to them when they initially go out. This is how you're going to influence the nations. So it starts off saying, I'm going to send you to the nations, and all these people are going to come back with you. And then as he goes through the chapter, he's telling them about how it's going to be at times when they're amongst the nations. The verses 1 through 7 are really, here's what it looks like when I send you out amongst the nations. So that's kind of like, it's not in order, it's not in sequential order here. He starts the oracle saying, in the future, all these nations are going to stream back to me. But verse 5 is more speaking of, we're back to the beginning, he's about to send them out to the nations as a punishment. But if they maintain their faith in Yahweh, their Elohim, that's how the nations will come. And that still correlates up to verse 2, where they've recognized Yahweh, the God of Jacob, as they come to his mountain. Yes, ma'am.
I also see an aspect of God saying that I will make a difference between those who worship me and those who are not, those who are worshiping idols. I will make a very clear difference when he says this. So we ourselves will walk in the name of Adonai Elohim forever and ever. It's like, yes, 5a, this may be what is happening with those who will worship idols, and B, it says, but then, that's the aspect I'm seeing. I will make the difference. People will know the difference between you and those who worship idols. It will be very clear.
Yeah, that's really good. I think that's spot on as the difference that's happening. And that difference that he maintains is how those people come to know him. Because if you think about it, when we don't establish that difference, when the world looks at us and thinks of us as no different than the rest of the world, people aren't compelled to come to him, you know. Looking to the end there, I don't want to, we're not going to get to it today, but all of this brought together, you get to the end of the chapter and he says that he's going to thresh out. He's allowing these enemies to come in and take Israel away. But those who don't turn to him, you know, he's basically saying, I'm going to send my people in the midst of those nations as a punishment. But they're going to be a beacon of light for the nations so that nations will come to me. But those who don't, I will destroy. He uses the threshing floor at the end of the chapter. And that's kind of what Joyce is saying there, that there's going to be a difference made. Those who would come to worship Yahweh, they will be the ones in the future deliverance and hope and blessings of God. Those who don't, they're going to be on the threshing floor. And he actually uses the people. This is part of the hope is, you're going to the nations, I'm punishing you. But when you come back, he says, he tells them that they're going to be the ones to thresh. That even though they've done all this harm to you, you'll be the ones. I'm going to make your horn like iron, your hoof like bronze. You're going to pulverize many people. So again, it's not all the nations don't come. We know this just from our own experience, that not everyone chooses to follow Jesus. That some choose themselves as their own idol or choose other real idols as idols. Some refuse to turn to God. And so I think that's kind of what he's saying. I like that. He's establishing a difference. We've got a few more minutes. Anything else on verse 5? We'll look at verse 6 real quick. Hopefully we can get through 6 and 7, and that'll finish the first little stanza. 6 says, "In that day, utters Yahweh, I will gather the lame, and those banished I will assemble, that is, those whom I disciplined." So what does this say? How is this working into the hope of Israel? And the hope for us as well. That's a good question. Who is the lame? And who are mine says banished. Anybody else say something else? The lame and the banished.
Ezekiel calls them the lost, the strayed, the injured, the weak.
Who are they? At the end of this verse, there's some technical difficulties with the translation, but I put in here, that is those whom I disciplined, to establish that the last line of this verse is actually saying who the lame and who the banished are. In some versions, that's not as clear. So the ones he disciplined are the ones that are lame and banished, and the ones that he's going to call back. So what kind of lame and banishment, what does this mean? Like they were just sent away and they got beat up? What does it mean to be lame and banished? Went through some correction. I think there's, just like the mountain metaphor, it's a very real picture of something that's deeper, the authority of God. Here, this lame and banishment, it's more about their spiritual wounding than it is anything else, right? Because they're being punished because they didn't follow him. And so they are going to suffer physical ailments. They're going to, it's going to be war. When Assyria and Babylon come in, it's war. It's the most horrible things you can imagine being done to them. It's not just like they pick up and move. They're ripped from their homes. Their women and children are horrible things done, killed, pillaged, all of these things. So they're real physical wounds. But the generation that it's talking about here that would be built up bigger is not that generation. So they're not feeling the physical wounds, but it's their spiritual wounds, that they were spiritually punished. The ones that it says he disciplined. So they're wounded and they're lame and banished through discipline from God. Deuteronomy 30 says, even if your exiles are at the farthest horizon, I will gather you and bring you back from there. Micah, again, is so focused, hyper-focused on Deuteronomy, that says when you do bad things, you're going to be cursed, but God will maintain his covenant. So what else? What else in verse 6? Afflicted, yeah, I like discipline because it highlights, so this verse is really weird because in some versions, you get this idea that God got mad and it's like Israel punched him and he punched him back. But that's not what's happening here. This is discipline like for a child, for its well-being. And that's why I kind of changed the translation a little bit, and I'm not the only one. There's other translations that do it justice as well. But it's not that God got mad and just started pummeling Israel. He's disciplined. So affliction can be discipline as well. Anybody else have something else there? Or
Is this paralleling with
Matthew
Matthew 11:28?
11:28, what's that say?
Come to me, all who are weary and burdened.
Oh, yeah. Come to me all. I think he's quoting maybe Isaiah there, but same concept. Come to me all who are weary. And that's really what God says throughout his prophets. I think of Jeremiah. He says, I'm divorcing you, but a few verses later says, I'm still your husband. Just come back to me. Just remember what this covenant meant. If there's one thing I remember, and I've kind of highlighted through Micah, we kind of get this idea that with Israel they had this covenant, they broke it, God did away with that covenant, and now we got to have this new covenant. But that's actually not the message. Like, even just in these few verses, the underlying message is, you broke the covenant, so you got to be disciplined. But I didn't break the covenant. I'm going to maintain the covenant. Talking about God, not Matt Napper. God says, I didn't break the covenant. I'm still going to maintain it. So you'll be disciplined, but I will, for my name's sake, I will bring you back. And so I think that's what a lot of times our biggest misconception of the Old Testament is like, well, that covenant, they broke it, so it was done. Couldn't be. But God says, no. I'm big enough to maintain the covenant for you. I think that's the big thing there. Anything else?
Also, is, in Matthew, where it says, blessed are the poor in heart,
Oh, yeah.
those that are hungry,
Matthew 5, yeah.
that are comfort and filled with stuff. This might have a bearing.
Yeah, those who are lame will be made whole. I think that is. And I think that is, oh man, I was trying to think of, I was studying healing in the New Testament. And a lot of times we see healing in the New Testament as just Jesus affecting the physical ailment. I was studying the man who was at the pool that couldn't go up to the temple for 38 years. And Jesus heals him. He says, pick up your mat and go to the temple. But the word there for healing means so much more than physical healing, that it was the wholeness of his whole spiritual being was healed. Like you're saying, that the oppressed can have food. He gives them food to eat, but he says, like, eat this food. Sure, he feeds 5,000, but he's giving them manna from heaven at the same time. I think that's a good point. That's a real good point. Yeah. So this promise comes 700 years before this happens in Micah, like the promise in Deuteronomy. He says, I'm going to send you to the nations, but I'll bring you back. So these people are hearing God affirm his word 700 years later. Zephaniah says it. He says, yes, at that time I will deal with all who oppress you. That's going back to Matthew 5 that Ron brought up. I will save the lame and gather the outcast. I will make those who were disgraced throughout the earth receive praises and fame. That's how Zephaniah words it. Ezekiel 34 says, I will seek the lost, bring back the strays, bandage the injured, and strengthen the weak, but I will destroy the fat and the strong. I will shepherd them with justice. That's how I love those two references. It's kind of the same thing there. What about God's discipline? Well, I kind of mentioned it when Jesse brought up affliction versus discipline. Again, Deuteronomy 29:21, and single him out for harm from all the tribes of Israel according to the curses of the covenant that's written. So he's talking about Israel there, single Israel out. This isn't God beating down Israel. It's not God putting Israel away forever. It's not him doing away with his covenant, but it's discipline. It's the same thing we discipline our children so that they'll learn and be better for it afterwards. What else in verse 6? Anything else?
Well, I just have to throw in, since we have chickens,
Since you have chickens.
I will gather her who is limping, is what I have.
Oh, yeah.
So now I've actually experienced the hen gathering the chick under her wings.
That's right.
I think of when I see I will gather her who is limping.
Yes, and Miss Pat has chickens, and she now has seen the bird put her wings out over her young children. That's the same idea, in the Passover. I think, at least how I was taught growing up, Passover meant that the enemy would pass over those who didn't have the blood, but actually it's this idea of God passing over, covering the houses that had the blood and protecting them. It's this, Passover is a very modern English word, but the word there for Pasach, which is the verbal root of Pesach, Pasach is to like a mother hen, like hovering over or just like you said, protecting the children there. We got just a few minutes, and we'll do verse 7, and we'll stop if we just keep going. But it says, I will make the lame as a remnant, and the removed as a mighty nation, and Yahweh will rule over the Mount Zion from now and forever. So here you have the shift from last verse. He's not just going to bring the lame back, or he's not just going to gather the lame or assemble the banished. You could gather the lame wherever they're at, right? But here, he kind of says, I'm going to make them a remnant. I'm going to build them up to a mighty nation. So those who were, there's a textual difference there in verse 7 where I put, and the removed as a mighty nation. Some may say, and the sick as a mighty nation. It doesn't really make sense because it's going with the verse before with the word banished. But those who are cast off, that's a good one, yeah. So those who are cast off, the people who don't even have a nation, they're living in someone else's nation, I'm going to make them a mighty nation. So any thoughts on this verse? It's almost self-explanatory, these past two verses kind of are, but again, Deuteronomy, and you can write these down, I'll read them real quickly. Deuteronomy 30, verses 5 and 9. It says, the Lord God will bring you to the land of your ancestors possessed, and you will take possession of it. He will cause you to prosper and to multiply you more than he did your ancestors. So again, Micah is calling back to this promise in Deuteronomy 30, where he starts off in Deuteronomy 30 saying, you're going to sin all these great sins, and I'm going to have to discipline you, punish you. You're going to have to be cast off. But you're going to turn your hearts back to me, and then I'm going to make you greater than you were before. That's kind of how it was. There's a shift in the language here, and I will make. So God's speaking in the first part of this verse, but the second half of the verse it says, and Yahweh will rule over them. So it goes from first person to third person, and we kind of talked about this in chapter 2, but there it was like a shift in the big chapter, and how Micah was showing that Yahweh was speaking through him and not the false prophets. But here he does this several times, but it's real neat, because it's really saying Yahweh's words are equivalent to his prophets. It's not just that Micah's saying a bunch of words. It kind of uses it poetically there. I think when it comes to this mighty nation with a new ruler, who's the new ruler? Who's the new ruler over Yahweh, over Israel in the future? I just said it, Yahweh. Yeah. So leading up to Micah, especially the northern tribes, they were trying to become as wealthy as possible. At the time of Jonah, so, about 50 to 75 years before this. At the time of Jonah, they were as rich as they had ever been. And so they had tried to do all this. They tried to be prosperous. They tried to be a mighty nation. But it didn't work when they did it in their own hands, right? And so Yahweh says, I will be your ruler, because only then can it be perfect in the way we intended. Any last thoughts from verse 7? Or that's an hour 15. So any last thoughts from verse 7 or the wholeness of the first deal here? Chapter 4, verses 1 through 7. I think I've been trying to rush through it, but I think it's okay that we slow down and don't take too long. I think, for this portion, some of the most beautiful eschatological passages come from the minor prophets, and we don't really read those that much. Micah and Amos and Hosea and all these things. But the depictions of the future hope was given to the Israelites as they anticipated exile. I think that's really important to understand. For a lot of people, like Jeremiah, gave hope to people who were already in exile. But for Micah, he says, hey, you're fixing to be carried away, punished, but here's hope to take with you. There's that concept in Micah that I really love. I think for us, as we await the second coming of the Messiah, I think that we can remember to, keep a perspective that we find here in Micah, that we wait not just for the fulfillment of our salvation and the future nation, and not just for the nations and judgment against those who are against evil, but that we wait a peace that has never been seen before. That time coming is really a time where there's no arguments, no fussing, no fighting, no war, no threats of Russia, no threats of your neighbor. You can look around and find videos of people that just act so nasty to each other. And, that's a future that we have to look forward to. I think that's kind of the places that I see here. The hope given to Israel is the same hope that we have. That's what I love about this chapter. It's a future beyond what they would experience. And so as we wait, I think we should remember what Mr. Ron or maybe Ms. Joyce pointed out. I think we should remember verse 5. This God creating a separation between those who would serve him perpetually. And that people can have the peace of God now, even when that future peace is still coming, if that makes sense. So we can just keep walking in God's ways and keep waiting for that future hope. Anything else? Yep. In that day. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a lot of times people look at verse 6 as if he's starting a new stanza or something, like that he's starting something new, but I think he intentionally doesn't say in the last days. What he's saying there in that day is what he's about to say, the remnant that I'll gather, is at the same time when the nations are streaming to the mountain, when there's utter peace, when there's no war, at that time, I'm going to have a remnant of all these broken-hearted people that are going to come to me, So in that day refers back to verse 1, that in the coming day when he starts to do all this, he's just kind of re-emphasizing that I'm going to do this for my people. Because really verse 1 through 5, verse 1 through 4, he's kind of talking about the nations and what they're going to do. In verse 6, he says, when I do that for all the nations, I'm also going to do this for my people. I'm going to heal them and make them a great nation. So that's a good question. It's a good question. Anything else? All right, we'll pray and give thanks, and then we'll break. Father, we come before you. We thank you for your word. We thank you for the time of fellowship together, to grow together, to learn from each other, and to learn your word and your character better. May we understand the words of Micah chapter 4 as a means of giving hope to those around us who have none. For those who don't know you, that don't know the precious blood of Christ that was given for us, that don't know the freedom from sin and death that you have paved the way for, that we may live lives of perpetually giving honor and glory, living in the name of Yahweh our Elohim, so that others will stream to you. We love you, we bless you, we thank you. You are our salvation, our strength, our healer, our redeemer. We love you and bless you. Amen and amen. Thank you all.